just really fits, absolutely fits to me that I truly believe that the Father it's just another part of the kingdom, the kingdom of the skies, like you say, it truly is, I think. And it's his way of, his people, the judgment was brought. And I think that the word, the truth of his son still went forth in whatever fashion it did, and then it lands on people like you and I and the others, we get those truths, and then we start finding out about things like the Dead Sea Scrolls and about first century Essenism, and then the doctrine of like the standing man and who Yaakov was. And to me, it's almost like the floodgates. It has to be through spirit. I truly believe that, because there's just no other way to ignite a hunger in people who I wasn't searching for this. I was perfectly content reading my good old King Jimmy Bible in a little independent church and being perfectly happy, doing that the rest of my life. I never really, but then all of a sudden it was just the Father had a different plan. He did. And I know I'm speaking to the choir, I guess, and it's just more of a thanksgiving than anything else than that. But it's just an amazing thing, when we can just ditch the idea of a Bible and which Bible is better. And all we have is writings from that time, from various different sources with people for different beliefs. And we have to just measure it out and prayerfully, and we have to trust the leadings of the Ruach. I really believe that. And bounce things and learn from people more learned than us that may know things that we don't, or I don't, and just kind of propagate truth that way. And to me, it's a powerful thing. And this last year, it's been really rough on me and my family. We've suffered some deaths. I've lost one of my closest club brothers. A deer jumped out and ended his life instantly. And we were there the night, and I saw his dead body, and I cried with his wife, and I have since with his children who were grown. But it was a rough time, and but during that time I got to share, the comfort of the Father and the peace that, you could know even through tragedy, and I've been blessed with having a couple men that I've been able to disciple to various degrees. And it's just, and the encouragement that I get from that, just from the steps that they take in their walk, and just to know that I could be a little part of that, and I say this with all humility, that is a tremendous blessing. And it's something I don't take lightly. So I am very anxious to share, tell my tale, so to speak, over the past, year, just in the hopes that somebody may cling to something from it and be edified or be encouraged to do something. But anyway, I'm sorry, Jack. I didn't mean to take like the mic there. Just kind of thank you very much for listening, brother. I appreciate that. And welcome you guys. Shalom to all of you.
I've got a couple comments. First of all, how fortunate you are. I see these people running around with masks and so scared. They're terrified. And I think primarily the reason they're so terrified is they don't know Elohim. They don't have that foundation. If you don't have that foundation, what are you banking on in your life? Where's your solid ground? There simply isn't any. And when we think that we wouldn't have that stable foundation anymore, what will we do? Or if we'd find out and be convinced that this God thing was all nothing but the opiate of the masses, what would we do? That's one thing I wanted to mention. The other thing is, unless you can believe what is written in Acts chapter 9, then the whole Paul thing, if that wasn't true, the whole Paul thing is false. All of it. because Paul does talk about him going somewhere and meeting Yeshua face to face, but he doesn't really say where. And the account of the Damascus Road is far later time, and Paul never mentions it. But the authentic letters of Paul is one of the most enlightening books that I've read, because it does sort out the grain from the chaff there, and it gives us a reason again to believe Paul once we get rid of the stuff that scholars have maintained didn't come from Paul. Once it's out of there, it is all of a sudden you've got a whole new apostle there, with a couple little exceptions, like him going to Europe and having to drop circumcision, drop the food ordinances, and some other of the concepts from the Torah, because they were illegal in Europe. And so he's going in not as a Jew, he's going in as another person with a foreign religion, and he has to keep the Roman law. Those things were against the law. If he go in to do that, then he wouldn't last long there. But anyways, it's a good find, and you can find the material from the authentic letters of Paul other places, and of course I found them here and there and everywhere, but I don't know of any that's put together in such a readable book as that. And there might be a few of them in there that maybe I don't agree with, and they're not adamant about it. It's kind of like, well, this is the reason this can't be authentic to Paul, and they give it in a way that we can understand. It's not like digging through all these other scholarly posts that are so hard to read on the same subjects. Sean's back. Sean's back. Hello, everybody. We got 4 in tonight. Isn't that great? So I'm going to get started right away, I hope. I suspect you can hear me all right. Okay, I take it that that is a yes, and I certainly am glad to see you here. Again, tonight we're working on the other Jewish revolt. This is the 3rd session. The other revolt, or the Maccabean Revolt, and tonight we cover the contests of Daniel. We still have a couple of important stories of Daniel that we need to go over. In the first session, we talked about where we're looking for our material on the Maccabean Revolt, and the only material that came from that time includes Daniel, 2nd Maccabees, and 1st Maccabees. And we get a really good roundabout kind of description of this revolt from those things. Josephus fills in a lot. However, of course, he was a couple hundred years later. Tonight, we're going to take up Daniel chapter 5, beginning with the handwriting on the wall. And I'm sure that you've heard several teachers on this subject. I really don't have a whole lot to add to it, but maybe a few minor concepts. If you have a question or comment, please do just break in anytime. That's fine. And we thank you, Father, for this opportunity to draw nigh unto each other again and nigh unto you. We ask that you be in this study and that you would draw forth for us from it great pearls of wisdom and understanding that we can use in our own lives today. And yes, there are many. Show them to us, we pray, in the name of Yeshua. Amen. Excuse me, I'm a little foggy tonight. We understand this to be a revolt against the Seleucid Empire of the Greeks, I hope you remember where this empire came from. And I think most of the people I have read on Daniel leave the Seleucid Empire completely out of the constructions from Daniel, like the beasts. And so they, in skipping that, they go to the Romans as one of the beasts, but the Romans aren't in there yet. The Romans weren't a great power at this time, speaking of about 165 BC. They were a power, but not the great power. That'll come in the next 150 years. We also might consider this revolt a type of civil war. And I encountered one quote from a scholar, Joseph Schultz, and here it is. Modern scholarship considers the Maccabean Revolt less of an uprising against foreign oppression than as a civil war between the Orthodox and Reformist parties in the Jewish camp. We understand a little about the factions of the Jews at this time. We can begin to see that, especially if we've read the book of Second Maccabees, because Second Maccabees, and to a lesser extent, First Maccabees, sets out a couple of these factions that we have within the Jews. As I've mentioned before, the Maccabean party took care of quite a few of the Hasidians, which are, we would call them Essenes today, and murdered them because they wouldn't take part in the second battle. So they just put them up, took care of them. It tells us a little about at least one faction. And we find, like in the third revolt, called the Bar Kokhba Rebellion, what I'm talking about, in 135 AD, that these Hasidians, known from the 2nd century BC, were known in the time of Bar Kokhba, almost 200 years later, as Galileans or Nazareans. They're the same thing. They were to be murdered or imprisoned because they prophetically saw the outcomes of the revolts and didn't see either the Maccabees or Bar Kokhba as messiahs. They would have rather just trusted Elohim than human messiahs, so-called. We might say that the Maccabees never proclaimed themselves as Messiah, but by taking the Triple Crown, high priest of the wrong family, king, and general, they might as well have called themselves messiahs, one after the other. As each of the brothers died away, another brother took over the Maccabean revolt. In both revolts, there were many deaths of Jews by Jews. Here's a little aside here from the Cave of Letters. This is a letter drawn from the hand of Simeon Bar Kokhba, or Bar Kokhba, however you want to understand him, who was proclaimed the Messiah by Rabbi Akiva sometime around 132 AD. Some of his letters were found in the Cave of Letters. And this is very important because these are actual letters from the hand of the so-called Messiah at that time. And he writes, from Simeon ben Kokhba to Yeshua ben Galgula, and to the men of the fort, peace, shalom. I take heaven to witness against me that unless you destroy the Galileans, you might want to read Nazareans there, because that's what they called the Nazareans in that particular century, 2nd century AD, who are with you, every man. I will put fetters upon your feet as I did to Ben Aflil. So what he's saying to the head of his fort is those Galileans, those Nazareans, those Hasidians those that don't consider me the Messiah, as Akiva has proclaimed, they need to be fettered up because we don't want them. We don't want them among our people because they're causing perfidy on account of them not believing that this revolt is going to show me as the Messiah. We don't have any writings like that from the Maccabees that we know of, but it's not unfeasible that there were such things. And certainly, as we read again in the Maccabean books, there was violence, Jews on Jews. Bar Kokhba was destined to imprison and destroy any Jewish denominations that were not fighting for his cause. I want to show you how clear this letter from Simon Bar Kokhba is with a little screen share, and how if you had a little bit of knowledge in Hebrew, you could probably just read this today, right off. I don't know whether that's been enhanced or not, but this is a particular text from about 135 AD. The letters are very well seen here. You can even see what kind of material that's on from this picture. And I think this is a Sukkot letter because what it says is, Shimon to Yehuda, son of Manasseh, at Kiryat Arabaya, I have delivered to you 2 donkeys in order that you dispatch along with them 2 men to Yehonathan, son of Bayan, and to Mesa Bala, in order that they pack up and deliver to the camp to you palm branches and citrons. What's that fruit they call a citron? That knobby little fruit that they take out at Sukkot and wave around.
Lulav?
It's part of the lulav. Lulav, and I can't think of it right now. And you are to send additional persons from your place and let them bring you myrtle branches and willows. That's also part of a lulav. And prepare them and deliver them to the camp because the population is large. Farewell. That was the longest of our Kokhba's letters, and right there it is from the Cave of Letters that was full of all kinds of different types of letters. Groovy. Everything okay here? Yeah. Also, I might mention that this idea of civil war, rather than war against a foreign power, might maybe include also the revolt of 70 AD, in which certain violent Jewish factions, zealots, Sicarii, Lestai, for instance, they would decimate any one of the Jews of their own people who didn't join their movement, including they killed hundreds of thousands of those seeking refuge in Jerusalem in 70 AD. The city, of course, was being run by 3 frogs out of the mouth of the beast: Eleazar, Simon, and John of Iscaiah in 70 AD. These were terrifically cruel men. These rebellious factions killed the priest, threw them over the wall, killed any citizen at any time they cared to rob them, And they starved out tens of thousands, if not more. Can't remember what the count was, but it was more like 750,000 people died of starvation in Jerusalem, because rather than feed the people, the rebels in there set fire to all the foodstuffs. They had enough food there for a war to go 10 years. And instead of feeding it out, they set it all on fire. And people ended up even eating their own children in Jerusalem during that Jewish revolt of 70 AD. So it was not only a revolt against Rome, but it was a civil war, certain factions against the people who called themselves Jews. Just they were not of the same belief as the ones in charge. Ones in charge were cruel, cruel men. Only one of them was taken alive. And he got his just deserts in Rome, being thrown down the steps from the high heights of Rome, the Roman city. There was a set of steps there. I can't think what they are now. But if they would catch a war enemy of the war and a leader, they would call for a public exhibition and throw that person down these steps. And that's what happened to Simon. I can't think of I haven't studied this for a while, so I can't really think of the surname right now. Also, now having more to do with what we're to look at tonight, we might consider a Dead Sea Scroll fragment. It has some bearing on our Daniel text today. Daniel 5, as you recall, tells us that Belshazzar was the son of Nebuchadnezzar. But actually, Nebuchadnezzar was Belshazzar's grandfather. There was a personage in between the two, the son of Nebuchadnezzar and the father of Belshazzar. And that person between the two generations was Nabonidus, King Nabonidus. And the scroll fragment, which is attributed to him, is called the Prayer of King Nabonidus. And Nabonidus was the actual father of Belshazzar. In Daniel, we get the information that Belshazzar was the son of Nebuchadnezzar, but historically, that's not quite right. There was Nabonidus in between, and the Dead Sea Scrolls acknowledges that with 4Q242 fragments. The words of the prayer said by Nabonidus, king of Babylonia, the great king, when afflicted with an ulcer on command of the El Elyon in Tema, I, Nabonidus, was afflicted with an evil ulcer for 7 years. And far from men I was driven until I prayed to the El Elyon, and an exorcist pardoned my sins. He was a Jew from among the children of the exile of Judah. And he said, recount this in writing to glorify and exalt the name of the El Elyon. Then, Nabonidus continues, I wrote this. When I was afflicted for 7 years by the El Elyon with an evil ulcer during my stay at Tema, I prayed to the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood, stone, because I thought and considered them gods. The end of the prayer is missing. The end of the account is missing. But we'll notice in reading Daniel 6 that this prayer of Nabonidus has some of the same features as Daniel 6, including the gods of these particular types of materials, silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, in the same order as the two. So the thought is somebody is looking to Daniel or some source document that is the same as Daniel for this prayer of Nabonidus that was netted in the great cache of scrolls. It's interesting to notice that the line with "have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone" returns in Daniel, just 22 lines below the story of the madness of Nebuchadnezzar. And the end of that's in Daniel, actually Daniel 4:37. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to abase. So could this be a historical note that Nebuchadnezzar, the great one, the one who Saddam Hussein said he was the reincarnation of, have been a believer? And we see his son then, Nabonidus, in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Did he then become a believer when he's praying to the gods of silver and gold and gets himself a good smackdown by the El Elyon? So if it was actually Nebuchadnezzar that confessed El Elyon, why was Nabonidus left out of the book of Daniel? Minor ideas that we'll never know unless maybe another cache of texts comes popping out of the ground. So now, having talked about Neb and Nab, we go on to Bel in the contest number 3, where the text is telling us, is this, I think this is, you tell me, maybe you have your Bible out. I didn't put, is this 5 or 6? I think maybe this might be the 5th chapter with Belshazzar. I need to put in my notes. It's got to be the 5th chapter of Daniel. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and he drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and silver, which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem, be brought, and that the kings and his lords, his wives, his concubines might drink from these vessels. Drink from the temple vessels? Have they no fear in this age? 3, then they brought in the golden and silver vessels, which had been taken out of the temple, the house of Elohim in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. Verse 4, and they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. There we find in that verse 4 the same order as in the scrolls prayer of Nabonidus. 5, immediately the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. This is almost like a projection up on the wall. Like over from the lampstand, maybe it was like a shadow hand writing on the wall. And when it happened in verse 6, the king's color changed and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way and his knees knocked together. 7, the king cried aloud to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, the astrologers. Chaldea is another word for Babylon. Chaldea is southern Babylon. That would be around Ur of the Chaldees, clear down south in what we call Iraq now. If you follow the Iraq War, that's where it started out, right there, just north of Kuwait in Chaldea country. And we read that Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldees. Ur of Chaldees, Chaldean means demon. So the Ur of Chaldees is the source of demons. That's where the enchanters came from, not that they came from the physical location of Chaldea, but certainly from the spiritual location of Chaldea. And to throw another one in, the astrologers. The king said to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they couldn't read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar in 9 was greatly alarmed again, and his color changed again, and his lords were perplexed. Then the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen said, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. Evidently, a person's color change, maybe they would turn from, say, green to blue, like a mood ring, or they might turn from red to green, something like that. There is in your kingdom a man in whom is the spirit of the holy Elohim. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar, very much like the new king's name, Belshazzar, Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. 13, then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king said to Daniel, you are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Yehuda, whom the king my father brought from Yehuda. I have heard of you, that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they couldn't show the interpretation of the matter. 16, but I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered before the king, let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to somebody else. Nevertheless, I'll read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. Oh, there's still two long paragraphs of this. This just, when I was a kid reading this, I could almost see this happening in my mind. It didn't scare me, but I was thinking, what if that hand came into my bedroom and wrote on the wall? I was kind of puzzled by the whole thing. 18, O king, the El Elyon, the most high Elohim, gave Nebuchadnezzar your father's kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave them, says Daniel, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him, whom he slew, and whom he kept alive, whom he raised up, and whom he would be put down. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken with him. And as you remember, he became as a beast, rolling around on the ground, maybe in a mosh pit. He was driven from among men, and his mind was made like that of a beast. Right now, I'm thinking up 300 years, and I'm thinking about Antiochus Epiphanes. His mind was, or Epiphanies, as he was called, the madman. And his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of the sky, until he knew that the Most High Elohim rules the kingdom of men and sets over it whom he will. And you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this, but you have lifted up yourself against the sovereign of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you and your lords, your wives, your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you praise the gods of silver and gold, of bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the Elohim in whose hand is your breath and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. And this in 26 is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, Elohim has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Parsin, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar commanded, and Daniel was clothed with purple, and a chain of gold was put around his neck. It's like he didn't, oh yeah, that was a great performance, but he didn't believe it. And proclamation was made concerning him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So not only is Belshazzar slain, but a whole new administration comes in, not from Babylon, but from the Medes and Persians, Darius, and a friendlier bunch, by the way, because after Darius, there was a Messiah to come, and that was the Messiah Kyrus, or Cyrus, or in some old Bibles, Koresh. Darius the Mede, or Darius the Mede, received the kingdom being about 62 years old. So with the temple spoils, we see them being used even as holy items by heathens, harlots, pagan lords, enemies of Elohim, devils, and they're praising the name of all the gods but the El Elyon, the Most High, to whom the accoutrements actually belonged. These didn't belong to the Jews. These didn't belong to the temple. They belonged to the El Elyon, El Shaddai, Yahweh. Then the handwriting on the wall, which, as a matter of fact, is Aramaic, or so I've been told, MNH, Mene, tallied, numbered, and Mene is on there twice, and that's for good reason. Tekel means weighed, and PRS, TKL, Tekel, PRS, Parsin, some scriptures say Peres, P-E-R-E-S, P-A-R-S-I-N, or P-E-R-E-S, which means divided. But that has a double meaning, as divided should. Parsin is also the word that we use as Persia today. Also Parthia. Also Pharisee. Also even the language of that area today, Farsi, that is Iran. Iran is the modern day name of the kingdom of the Medes and Persians. They were two related peoples. They were not Arabs. They were not Greeks. These people were Persians. But the handwriting on the wall spells it out. Who's taking over this kingdom? Your days are counted, your acts are weighed and found lacking, and your kingdom is divided by the Medes and Persians. I believe that the Pharisees, who may have come along later, yes, certainly in the 1st century BC, there's a lot of words in the text about Pharisees. I think they came over from Parthia or Persia. They're both the same thing. I think they came over bringing some of the beliefs of the Zoroastrians. I think they may have been at one time Jews that had been taken over there in the dispersion and lived there for hundreds of years and then decided to come back, but they brought back with them certain doctrines that were far and away no part of Judaism at that time. Again, I'm talking about right after the Maccabean period, within 100 years or so, here they come. And they actually took over the temple then in about 90 BC. And look at some of the doctrines. Well, I'll tell you one at least that is pervasive and that didn't really exist in the Hebrew texts until they came around, and that was resurrection of the dead. Who was it in the New Testament who says, I'm merely speaking of resurrection of the dead? I'm not talking about their religion. I'm not trying to deal with their wrongness. I'm just talking about the resurrection of the dead. Surely you believe that. Well, that's why you don't see it in the earlier Old Testament, in the Torah. You see something like that in Job, chapter 19, I think. I know that my blood avenger, my Geol, lives, and he will avenge me in the last day, something like that. So we also have two menes, because Antiochus IV plundered the temple twice. Although this is about the end of Babylon, in the days of the physical person, Daniel, it is meant for a readership. That was about 500 something BC. So it was meant for readership 400 years later. In part of that time, you know, where your Baptist buddy says that God was silent, those 400 years. So it's counted twice, and that's been a big question as to why, because the actual audience of this is 400 years later. This wasn't written in the time of Daniel. I mean, if Daniel existed back there during the time of Nebuchadnezzar, this is all we really know about it. But he pops up all of a sudden in 164 BC with this text, and it becomes hugely popular. And it sprouts off of itself a whole new genre. That is the genre of the apocalyptic. I think I'm going to talk about that again later. But last week we went into some depth on what the difference between apocalypse and prophecy. Apocalypse is not meant but the very end of an apocalypse to tell any future. What it does is in cryptic language, especially in times of war, it tells about the present time, And these types of writings were to like a newsletter to get the news out to people who were concerned all over the world. Remember, the Jews were spread out all over the place, but they were always interested in what was going on in Jerusalem, no matter if they lived in Afghanistan. They were interested in what's going on, and these texts would go out, but the enemies couldn't read them. And Americans can't read them either unless they know the code here. And where do we even get a start on that code? The history. If we learn what we can about history, especially the historical passages of the Tanakh, we get a start on that code. We got to know the prophets too, because the words that are often used in apocalyptic writings are prophetic type words. So they tell the present news and happenings of what's going on, primarily in Jerusalem or Israel, to be published out into Jewry all over the world, like a newspaper, like, what's going on there now. But so as their enemies who came from completely different cultures and knew nothing about the history of Israel would not be able to read them. Same thing for Revelation. Revelation is a book of contemporary history for the time between 66 and 73 AD. And we do have a history there that we can read, somebody that was there, and that's Josephus. And we read the two together. We think this is all this could be is history, getting out in a cryptic language of apocalypse. So the enemies couldn't understand it. And what if the Romans did get that? They couldn't understand what it was about. They would think it's a whole lot of future nonsense, like some people do today. But it's not nonsense. It gives us lessons years and centuries later that the people of 167 BC were getting through this book of Daniel that was, at least in the first half of it, attributed to 400 years before. So we've got too many tekel, upharsin or parson. And it happened. That was happening really at the time. Here comes Darius. Now, what happened? Time is it? Oh, I'm about done. What happened to the corresponding king? The king that corresponds with Belshazzar in the 160s BC. We have determined, without yet getting into the visions of Daniel, that was Antiochus Epiphanes, or Epiphanies the fourth, the crazy man. He's the one that robbed the temple twice. He's the one that brought out the accoutrements from the temple. He's the one that ate with them. He's the one that invited all his harlots and pagan lords in to eat with them and praise their many gods with property of El Elyon. And so we have, jumping to 2 Maccabees 9, we have an account of what happened to him. Belshazzar, he died that very night. So in cryptic sense, when Daniel's talking about Antiochus in the later time period, that his punishment will be soon and quick. And here is that account for 2 Maccabees 9, 5 through 9. But the all-seeing sovereign, the Elohim of Israel, struck him with an incurable and invisible blow. As soon as he stopped speaking, he was seized with a pain in his bowels, for which there was no relief, and with sharp internal tortures. And that very justly, for he had tortured the bowels of others with many and strange afflictions. Yet he didn't in any way stop his insolence, but was even more filled with arrogance, breathing fire in his rage against the Jews and giving orders to drive even faster in his chariot. And so it came about that he fell out of his chariot as it was rushing along, and the fall was so hard as to torture every limb of his body. Thus he who only had a little while before had thought in his superhuman arrogance that he could command the waves of the sea, and had imagined that he could weigh the high mountains in a balance, counting and weighing, was brought down to earth and carried in a litter, making the power of Elohim manifest to everyone. And so the ungodly man's body swarmed with worms. And while he was still living in anguish and pain, his flesh rotted away. And because of the stench, the whole army felt revulsion at his decay. It seems like in those days, that is the punishment Elohim used for bad kings that wouldn't repent. Look, Herod the Great, Herod Agrippa, at least those two I can think of, that sprouted worms from their belly. Can you imagine what that was? Syphilis, their private parts all swelled up. It sounds very horrible, but there's no reason to think that it's not historical. Why should it be? To this, we can add just a little more as far as the Parthene or Parthia. Antiochus probably died in Parthia, in Parthene. Antiochus finally gave the Jews over to one of his generals, and he decided that he would go and attack Parthia anyway, not understanding the newsletter called Daniel of the Jews, that this place was bound to be bad for him. And during the campaign against the Parthians or Persians, all the same, this is when it happened to him with the chariot and the worms and the whole bit. Now, let's see. Do I want to go on here? Oh, maybe a little bit. I have some maps. These empires of this time over the land that Alexander had conquered, they just seem to be like different colors of jello, in and out, attacking, retreating. Sometime, one day they're in Armenia, one day they're not. One day we've got the Seleucid kingdom, the next day we don't. So let me start. With one little jello here. This goes back to the time of Nebuchadnezzar, Here's Egypt. Here's the Babylonian Empire. You know, Israel's Jerusalem right there. Babylonia is right here. I was thinking that actually, yeah, that part right there, this is Iraq. It's got Babylon, Nikur, Uruk, of the Chaldees all along the Euphrates River. Nineveh. This is the Iraq portion, and I would say probably down here is the Syria portion of the Babylonian Empire, which went clear across the Sinai and across Jerusalem. And here's Media. Media is Iran. Now, Iran's not up here. Iran's over here. Persepolis, Persepolis, Ecbatana. You read about those cities in the Apocrypha of the Old Testament. And Susa, that's the city of Tobit. So we have the Medes and the Persians going out from their normal place there in Iran, across the top of Iraq, and just squiggling through here. Okay, so this is before Alexander the Great. Here we have 300 BC, about 150 years before the writing of the book of Daniel. Babylon's gone. There's the Seleucid Empire right here of the Greeks, and at the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, it included this area as well in Syria and down through Judea. I know you can't see that very well, but maybe I can view it a little better. Zoom level. $150, where did it go? Where did you go? Got to be here. 150, we'll try a little more. Format. View. Is this going to help any? Of course, it's going to take me way far away again. All right, see it a little better. Gaza, Samaria, Jerusalem is here, and it's not attached yet to this part of Alexander's winnings. Yeah, he'd won the world by then. I think 331 was his terminal date. Here's the Ptolemaic Empire. The Seleucid Empire went from here, Armenia, clear across there through India, a long, long way. And the other two generals of Alexander, they got these little places up here. There's one more. This is 3rd century, that's 200 BC. Parthia is here, it's independent, about 250 BC. So Parthia is a construct of the Seleucid Empire, which had its own culture and its own language. These Parthians were Persians, like I mentioned. What's the guy's name? Stephen Collins has a great book on Parthia. Everybody should read it if you want to know anything about this time. Parthia took kind of a quiet but large piece of the Holy Land, and for quite some time. You probably heard of the three wise men, huh? If there were three. Colin said there were at least 10,000 wise men and an army that came over here to Jerusalem, to the baby in the manger. No wonder Herod and all of Jerusalem was troubled. So pretty soon this Seleucid kingdom, it's going to shrink down. Parthia is going to come on through the Roman Empire times. And Parthia is never conquered by the Romans. They just give back and forth Armenia. I think that's it. All right, it's been an hour. I don't want to keep you past the witching hour of 11 because you've got witches to fight tonight. Pray for, pray against. Don't be a Nebuchadnezzar. Yeah, it makes a lot more sense. I have the book here, but it's in pieces. We've read it so much when we were reading it that the thing just fell apart. I have to get another one, though. It explains it very well, and it makes a lot of sense. Okay, you guys, enjoy yourself tonight. Get some good sleep. Tomorrow, come out with your gloves off to fight the devil. Amen? Amen.